Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. First of all, please silence your cell phones. And I would like to thank the Manchester Community Library for welcoming us here in this space. I'd also like to thank our media sponsor, GNAT-TV, for being here to videotape the program and for running the live stream feature. A welcome to those joining us online. What we have coming up next Tuesday, November 7th, Matthew Delmont is a Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor of History at Dartmouth College, and his talk is Half American, the Epic Story of African Americans Fighting World War II at Home and Abroad. His book with the same title is available at the Northshire Bookstore. That is at 5:30, and that will be here in the Manchester Community Library. Our guest this evening is a geopolitical consultant and strategist who has spent decades advising clients on global politics and economics. He is chairman and CEO of the Tallberg Foundation, domiciled in Sweden. He resides in Dorset. Please give a warm welcome to Alan Stoga.
Good evening. Thank you, Gloria, and thank you all for coming. This is one of those topics that unfortunately we're going to keep on talking about next week, next month, next year. What I want to do today is maybe 5 things. I want to provide you some background. What's the context in which all of this is happening? Discuss the war itself, but really in the context of 2 competing frames, because I think I'm going to argue this is either the last war of one era or the first war of another era, and it really matters which one it is. I'm going to make the case for optimism, but also the case for pessimism, and let you choose. Discuss what might happen when the fighting ends, because it's the nature of war that fighting will end. And then finally talk a little bit about U.S. interests in this, as well as some potential knock-on consequences. Let me start, though, with a map. I love maps because geography is one of those things that is determinative. You can't change the geography. You probably all know the geography of Israel. What's going on right now, of course, and relevant, the Lebanon border up at the top. Hezbollah controls Lebanon, and there's been some fighting across that border, but not very much. I'll talk about that in a minute. Obviously, Gaza Strip, lower left over there. Gaza Strip is 3 times the size of Manchester. I'll show you in a moment. It's a tiny, tiny little place. The West Bank, around Jerusalem, and then the neighboring states. You really need to think about this as 1 state, Israel, and 4 enclaves, which are Palestinian. And that's not accidental. It is the result of very conscious strategy over the last many years. Part of the problem, and demographics is also determinative. There are today about 7.6 million Jews in Israel. It is a Jewish state. In the Constitution, it's a Jewish state. There are another 1.6 million Palestinian Arabs living within the borders of Israel, but also, as you can see, large concentrations of Arabs, Palestinians, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Jerusalem. Part of the problem is that the birth rate in Israel among Jewish families is about 1.6%. The birth rate of Palestinians is north of 2%. So by 2030, at the latest, the populations have flipped. So if you're a strategist and you're thinking about how do you organize this, one of the things you don't do is 1 state. 1 state in which the Jewish population is minority cannot happen. You may not want 2 states because that other state is growing. If you think people matter, that other state is going to be considerably larger than you in population terms, not just by 2030, but this curve goes out. 47% of Palestinians are under the age of 18. So most of the demographic growth is ahead of them. This curve is going to accelerate probably, not slow down. Gaza. So as I said, it's about 3 times the size of Manchester, but it really is tiny. That coast on the Mediterranean is about 40 kilometers long. The width, the Egyptian border, is only 13 kilometers, the distance from Dorset to Manchester. The population, and again, I hope you can see this, this is that map sort of turned sideways. The density of population is much greater in the north. There are two cities in the south, and then in the center, and then Khan Yunis in the back, in the bottom. But the big population concentrations are in the north, which is where, at the moment, all the fighting is. Remember, a couple weeks ago, the Israelis asked all of those people up to Wadi Gaza to move. That's 1 million people, probably 1 million people plus. Many of them did move. You can see the concentrations of buildings. That's the gray, light gray. The dark gray are refugee camps. And those are the tunnels. There is something like 200 miles of tunnels under this tiny little place. Jokingly, it's called the Gaza Metro. And it is the tunnels that are the focus of this war because that's where Hamas runs its operations from. And these tunnels are really, someone said the other day, oh, it's just like Vietnam. Absolutely, positively not. These are serious tunnels that have been built 30 to 60 kilometers below the ground. They have train tracks in some of them. They have missile-making factories in others of them. Some are very unsophisticated, but some of them are really, really quite sophisticated operations. Those are the known tunnels, obviously, but it's a fraction of what's down there. And that's where Hamas is tonight, in those tunnels. Right now, well, we got the map. With the Israelis, what's happened so far after October 7th is the Israelis have come in from the north, and where that arrow points to, they've now surrounded Gaza City up in the north. And this is a very complicated operation. Gaza, though, is a mess. Before the war, it was a mess. It is a humanitarian disaster. You can read the numbers as well as I can read the numbers. On any measure, health, education, welfare, food, water, electricity, you name it, the place is not third world, maybe fourth or fifth world. Now, the question obviously is why? It's not shortage of money. They collect a fair amount of taxes. This is, since 2005, but intensely the last couple of years, Gaza Strip is a sealed place. There's an entrance at the bottom and an entrance at the top. Only, as you can see, something like 17,000 to 19,000 Palestinian workers are allowed out every day. So most of the people in Gaza are in Gaza. But they have to import things and export things. The Palestinian Authority, or actually now Hamas, collects taxes on all that. The Hamas organization collects a lot of revenue from a lot of places around. It's not a shortage of money necessarily. I'm going to argue, as I will right here, it's a shortage of leadership. It's a shortage of politicians who are, in fact, trying to build a state. I'll get to Gaza in a second. This is Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, who is the president of the Palestinian Authority. After the Oslo Accords, as you remember, the idea was that there would gradually evolve two separate states. The two-state solution was rooted in the Oslo Accords. The Palestinian Authority had an election across both parts of Palestine. This man won the presidency in 2006. He's now 87 or 88, depending on whose numbers you believe. He has been seriously ill for at least the last couple of years. He is probably dying, but nobody can quite tell. They haven't had a presidential election since 2006, I'm sorry. He's wildly unpopular. The leadership, he in particular, the rest of his leadership, everyone recognizes, including the Palestinians, corrupt, incompetent, unpopular, unable to provide either security or prosperity. The latest polls I have seen, which were just before October 7th, 50% of the Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, want the Palestinian Authority to disappear. 80% want him to go. There is no confidence within the Palestinian people of the leaders, air quotes on that word, of the leaders who are responsible for governing. Hamas. As some of you know, Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, or rather, it's rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood, started in 1987 in Gaza. Their original constitution was fundamentally opposed to Israel's existence. A couple years ago, they did a redraft of that, and they struck the word Israel and put Zionism. Now, from Hamas's point of view, every Israeli is a Zionist, so this was sort of a lawyer's kind of solution to pretending they weren't, in fact, opposed to the existence of Israel. Hamas is opposed to the existence of Israel. It is deeply inside their DNA. They won in 2006, and that's one of those elections when you talk about the disappearance of democracy in the world. Hamas won the Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006. We and the Europeans have decided, and the Israelis, we can't have Hamas running the legislature. So we sort of push them aside. Palestinian Authority inherits the legislature, but only in the West Bank, because when they tried to inherit it in Gaza, Hamas, which has their roots in Gaza, in fact said, no, you're not going to do that. And there was a violent push of the Palestinian Authority out of Gaza. They govern in accordance with Sharia law. I would put big quotes on that word govern because, again, given those outcome statistics, the health, welfare, education, etc., they're not doing very much governing. That said, they are far more popular than the Palestinian Authority among Palestinians, partly because the Palestinian Authority is perceived as being subject to Israel, being too willing to work with the Israelis. Hamas clearly does not want to work with the Israelis and does not work with the Israelis, as we've seen. If there were an election tomorrow, again, the last polls from just before October 7th, the outcome says that guy in the middle, Marwan Barghouti, would win the presidency. Now you can see he's in handcuffs. He's in handcuffs because he's in jail for a very long time for murder, but they probably could have accused him of a lot of other things. But he is a prisoner. He is the most popular Palestinian, if you believe the polls. This guy in the lower right-hand corner is the political leader of Hamas. He more or less lives in Qatar. The Israelis insist he's become a billionaire living in Qatar, which may well be true. But he runs the political operation from there. Is viewed as sort of corrupt, but not that corrupt. Would he win an election? He might be able to win an election. The person we really, really don't like tonight is the guy in the upper right-hand corner. That is the military commander of the Al-Qassam brigades. He is the one who planned and executed the October 7th operation. Mohammed Deif is his nom de guerre. Deif actually means guest in Arabic, and that's because he never sleeps in the same place 2 nights in a row. The Israelis have been hunting him for years unsuccessfully. Israel. And again, many of you would already know this. It is Israeli habit during a war to install a unity government. As fractious as Israeli politics always is, when they are attacked, they come together. It has happened during every major conflict. The opposition says, okay, well, all this other stuff will stop. Until we win this war, we are a unity government. This is the war cabinet of the unity government. From left to right, Yoav Gallant is the defense minister. He is a Likud member. He's a general. He was a chief of staff of the IDF. He resigned. He's been in the Netanyahu cabinet for some time. He resigned a couple months ago over the judicial conflict. Once the conflict over the reforming of, air quotes on reforming, of Israel's judiciary began to affect the IDF, because the reservists started to say, we're not going to report for duty if you insist on continuing this political reform. Gallant stood up in the cabinet and said, we got to stop this stuff. Security is more important than the judicial reform. Netanyahu fired him. When they put the government back together for the war, they had to bring Gallant back. He's very, very good. He, however, he's very tough. He was involved in fighting the intifadas for Israel. He is on record. If you Google his name and look for quotes from General Gallant, you'll see him say that I had my boot on the neck of Hamas in 2014, and the politicians made me take it off. This time I won't. He's a tough guy. Benny Gantz is, again, a former general, also former chief of staff, head of the National Unity Party. Today, he's probably the most popular politician in Israel. There was a poll recently after October 7th, a poll on politics, on the government, etc. And something like 48% of the people said they want Gantz as prime minister. Once this is over, 29% said they wanted Netanyahu. Netanyahu, I don't have to tell you anything about him. He's been prime minister for some time. He is a genius politician. He manages to find a way to put together a government when nobody else could even imagine how you could do that. But like most of Israeli society, it has shifted steadily and steadily to the right. Ron Dermer is Minister for Strategic Affairs. So the three guys, those three guys have votes in the military cabinet. They decide what happens in the war. These two guys are advisors. Ron Dermer is Netanyahu's second. He was ambassador in Washington. He's now Minister for Strategic Affairs. He's sort of the alter ego. He's the polished version of Netanyahu. Very smart guy. He does foreign affairs and strategy for the government. And then finally, Gadi Eisenkot was former general. He headed Southern Command. He didn't make it quite to the top. He made it to the second level. Again, he's viewed as a very quiet but very, very effective general. So think about how the United States fights war and how Israel, or think about World War II, Britain fight wars. They suspend domestic politics. They say, okay, all this stuff we've been fighting about, it's over. And in fact, the deal that Gantz made to come into the government said, judicial reform, not a word can be spoken on this subject until the war is won. And then we're leaving, and everything can start again. But there will be elections. I'm going to try to make very few forecasts tonight. The forecast I will make, Netanyahu's career is finished. One of the things the Israelis are very, very good at is after this kind of event, they do, in a very sophisticated way, a postmortem. They think through, they have an independent commission, and they will do it again. Who got what wrong? Where were the mistakes made, both before the conflict and during the conflict? And then who should be fired? So those of you who have seen the movie Golda, one of the themes in Golda, if you remember, is that there is that commission that is trying to understand what happened and who is at fault. That commission ended up firing half a dozen generals, did not fire Golda. It absolved Golda. She resigned a couple weeks later saying that it was my responsibility. I should leave office because I failed. This guy's finished. Whatever we discover actually happened, it's on his head, and most Israelis of both parties, of all parties actually, think that is the case. Over 75 years, Israel is 75 years old. This is my count of the wars. Constant warfare, as you know, since 1948, since the inception of Israel. That creates a society that has a couple of characteristics. One, as I said, when they're challenged, they come together. Forget everything else, solve this problem, get us back to security, to stability, and then we'll figure things out. Two, they know they live in a risky world. That's not true of the United States. We don't know we live in a risky world. We forget it every now and then. We have to be reminded. We're always reminded. And then we say, oh my God, I forgot about that. Israeli society, however fractious, however diverse, however understands it's a risky world. Thirdly, the population, as I said earlier, is growing slowly. The part of the population that's growing is the most conservative part of the population. So demographics alone shifts the politics of Israel to the right. It has in the last couple of years. It will do so more in the next couple of years. That is neither here nor there in terms of how they fight this war, but it's important as you think about what they do after this war. So October 7th. What Hamas did on October 7th was premeditated barbarity. It was a raid in force. It was not an invasion. It was a raid in force with a very precise set of purposes I'll get to in a second. but essentially designed to shock, to surprise, to murder, to create insecurity in the Israeli population. They knew they were not, that it was a time-limited, couple hours is all they had. We can talk about how they got in with all the technology, et cetera, but that's not sort of important. What's important is that it was a raid-in force designed, in fact, more successful by all appearances than they expected it to be. What's happening since then has been a very systematic, overwhelming response designed to destroy Hamas. I want to talk about that. Can you destroy Hamas, which is a critical question. Time matters, and that's why these two quotes are there. Every war the Israelis have fought, once they get into the upper position, the world says, okay, guys, stop. So famously, again, you would know this anyhow, but you saw it in Golda. When Dr. Kissinger negotiated the last time with the Israelis, he was headed back to Washington. They were supposed to stop encircling the Third Army. That was the deal. The time was supposed to be now. He said, and it's accurately reported in the movie, okay, I'll give you 12 hours. I'm going back to Washington. By the time I get showered and back to the office, you have to have stopped. So the Israelis had a clock running. They knew how far they could get. They knew how long they had to get, how far they wanted to get. It was true in the '67 war. It's true in most of their wars. Where it's not been true, remember Sabra and Shatila. Remember Lebanon. Years ago, I'm going to get my years wrong, 82. Derek, help me. 82? Sabra Shatila, I think. The Lebanon invasion. Ariel Sharon is leading the tanks in, and they let the Christian phalangists destroy a camp. When their interventions take a long time, they usually have really bad human results. Now, that's partly because, think again how small Gaza is. There's not a lot of space there. So this is not, you can't attack Gaza without killing civilians. It's literally not possible. There is no way to do that. There's some questions there about that, however. So what are their war aims? Hamas is a terror organization. Their purpose is to terrorize. That's what that October 7th was about. It's what everything they've ever done is about. That is, in a sense, all they can do, but they do it really quite well. The Israelis have a habit of negotiating prisoner swaps. And if I know it, I guarantee you Hamas knows it. They usually are willing, the Israelis that is, to give up a couple thousand prisoners for one or two Israelis. So why did Hamas take hostages? Because Israel always negotiates for hostages. This is a known, nasty, violates all sorts of rules of law, horrible thing, but very purposeful. There's something like 5,000 at least Palestinians in Israeli jails. Could be more than that. Hamas wants them back. They want to break the momentum towards Arab-Israeli peace. Now, we don't talk about peace anymore, but in the last, you know about the Abraham Accords, which started while Trump was in office, where a whole series of Arab countries, from Morocco to the UAE, have extended diplomatic relations, have opened offices, are trading, are working together as though they have no problems. They've said all this stuff from the past we're finished with. The Saudis and the Israelis have been deep in those negotiations. You can go back again, go Google. About 3 weeks ago, the question was, would they get it done before the end of the year or early next year? Why did Hamas, and if you're Hamas, if you're Palestinian, you're raising your hand and saying, wait a minute, what about us? You're making these deals with these $1 billion flowing back and forth, and you're leaving us here and forgetting about us. And Hamas, one of the things they did on October 7th was to remind everyone, you've got to take us into consideration. We want, and so far today, the Bahrainis pulled their ambassador back. The Jordanians pulled their ambassador back. It's having those kinds of diplomatic consequences. They have publicly said they wanted to halt the Israeli attacks on Aqsa. That's in their propaganda. and they would like to lift the blockade on Gaza. Strikes me as it's exactly the wrong way to lift the blockade, but that's what they say. What does Israel want? Clearly, overwhelmingly, they want to crush Hamas by destroying its capacity to terrorize. In practice, that means kill the leadership, kill as many of the fighters as possible, destroy the infrastructure. Now, the fighters, there's something on the order, the numbers vary, you saw in an earlier slide, something on the order of 20, 25, 30,000 fighters, Hamas fighters in Israel, in Gaza. And by definition, small place, they're intermixed among the population. No way to separate. So yes, if I were the spokesman for the IDF, I would also be saying, wait a minute, one of their key bases seems to be underneath that big hospital. What are we supposed to do about it? And that's a problem. They want to recover the hostages. I think that is a distant second in their war aims. That's in the nice to have category. They can't say that out loud. They have to say we want the hostages back. But if they have to choose between destroying Hamas and saving hostages, I think they're going to try to destroy Hamas. They clearly wanted to reaffirm the depth of American support. They don't actually care about the Europeans. They care about us, and they have accomplished that. And then they want to demonstrate national unity. There is all sorts of speculation all over the world that the reason Hamas went now is because of all of those demonstrations in Israel over the last couple of years, where clearly society is at its, there's almost endless conflict inside Israel. I'm a little skeptical of that, but clearly the Israelis know they need to demonstrate to the regional neighbors, to the great powers, that in fact they are all on the same page, hence the national unity government. So, two competing frames. As you saw from that list of wars, Israel has been at war since literally before it was born, because the fighting actually started before 48. But the narrative that we've lived with for these 75 years has been Arab versus Israeli versus Israel, Sunni versus Shia, the Iran-Iraq war, the Saudis versus the Iranians, ideology and sectarianism instead of peace and prosperity. Nobody cares about economics. They care about your religion, they care about your ideology, and they'll go to war over it. The great powers, whether it was Russia or us, or before Russia and us, the British and the French, there has been, you can make a case that the great powers have been mucking around in the region since Napoleon, since he showed up in Egypt, and almost a straight line since then. But the upside of, and they are armored, I mean, they provide all of the weaponry. I'm just re-listening to a book on the '67 war, and I had forgotten that, and Derek, you reminded me of it the other day, all of the Israeli jets in '67 were French, because that was just at the end of the French support for Israel. De Gaulle had come back and cut it off. We have been the armorers of the region. That arms race now has the potential, it is nuclear, the Israelis have nuclear weapons. The Iranians are this close to nuclear weapons. They are what is now called in the biz a nuclear threshold state, which is to say they've got everything done, they just got to sort of finish. It's hard to imagine that the Gulf states, if the Iranians get the weapon, it's Tom Lear time, so too will the Gulf states want weapons. For better or worse, and this is the result of how the great powers have worked in the region, neither side ever really loses. Think back to the Iran-Iraq war, when we got very active supporting the Iraqis. Saddam Hussein was our ally, actually, because we didn't want the Iranians to win. So the great powers have always been sort of, it's like a bowling alley. They put the bumpers in the lanes so that, yeah, they can do nasty things to each other, but you really don't want anybody to actually win. You just want it to eventually go away. That's how the world has worked for 75 years. New world. Great powers, they're around, but they are not determinative. The regional powers, and that's Turkey, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Iran. I don't think Egypt, but some would insist putting Egypt. It's certainly Israel. The local powers are becoming strong in and of themselves, and you can just feel them beginning to push against each other, to muscle each other, trying to figure out how does this world work. The coalitions increasingly seem to be based on interests, not ideology, which is a huge change. For the better or worse, by the way, it's a huge change. Non-state actors are increasingly important, obviously, and we've seen this for several years. It's Islamic Jihad, it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it's Hamas, it's a whole series of people that have more space in this new world, I think, to operate, and that's not good. And nobody really knows what the rules are. You knew what the rules were before, and as this new world evolves, you're not quite sure who's the rule maker, what's going to happen if I do this or that. And one of the questions at the table is the bottom one. You can judge how well the great powers have done in the Middle East over the last dumpty years. Will the local powers do a better job than we, the great powers, did in terms of actually producing what they deserve, peace and prosperity? So, optimism versus hope versus pessimism. And I want to start with optimism because you have to. So far, so good is the answer. Right now, the conflict has more or less been contained. Iran's made noises. Iran clearly helped plan this. That's proven. But they didn't leave their fingerprints on it. So gentlemen can look at each other and say, oh, but there's no Iranians there. There's some Iranian money, but there's no Iranians there. But they've gone out of their way not to provoke Israel. At least at the moment, it's pretty clear Iran doesn't want to fight. It's pretty clear that Israel doesn't want to fight Iran either. That's a different point. Hezbollah in Lebanon is mostly quiet. You're going to hear, if you were listening to NPR today, you heard, oh, some more missiles came in and then some more missiles went out. That's sort of noise. That's not serious stuff. When it gets serious, when Hezbollah gets serious, they've got enough heavy missiles that border becomes really quite dangerous. But at the moment, Hezbollah is mostly quiet. The Arab criticism has been the minimum they could possibly do. In the old days, by now, we'd have an oil embargo, we'd have all sorts of exhortations. Tomorrow's Friday, we'll see what happens in the mosques tomorrow. But so far, they've criticized, but not loudly, and focused on humanitarian needs of the Palestinians. China negotiated a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran early this year so that they recognized each other, opened up embassies. There's a lot flowing between Iran and Saudi Arabia at the moment. I think China is a tempering influence at the moment in a positive way. One of the known unknowns is, what did China promise the Saudis for them to do the deal with the Iranians? I'm willing to bet that they promised that they will not go to war, at least in the short run. Can't prove it, but it has that feel that the Chinese are getting good at playing these games. Hamas shock. Best thing that's happened in Israeli politics, obviously, is because you got rid of all the crazy stuff. It will get rid of Netanyahu. There will be an election within a year. You will probably get, knock on wood, a less right-wing government following this one. It's a hell of a way to fix politics, but it looks like it could be going in a way that would be positive. That's about domestic politics. It says nothing about their interaction with the rest of the world or what they're going to do in Hamas, in Gaza, or in the West Bank. I think the U.S., and we can talk about that later if you want, our full-throated support for Israel has substantially diluted our influence in the region. Not only in the region, but throughout the global South. Now, that may be good or bad. I think it's just a fact. And the reasons that the Arabs and the Israelis were headed towards rapprochement existed before this. They'll still exist after this, so that there's at least a possibility that it comes back. The problem is the bottom one. There is no way this works unless something can be done, not to solve the Palestinian problem, but to create a space where the Palestinians can actually have a life. Now, they're the problem. I'm not arguing it's other people's problem. But absent something different in the West Bank and Gaza, I have a hard time suspending my hopeful pessimism. Case for pessimism, the wider war. The impact on Israel, on Israeli society, we'll know in the long run, but it certainly feels like it could be even deeper than 73. This 73 was a war, armies against armies. This was terror. This was brutality. This was, you've all read the stories and seen it. This, if you think you're secure, and then all of a sudden this can happen, the impact on, it's post-traumatic stress time for the whole country. The objective conditions in Gaza and the West Bank are breeding grounds for barbarism. That's a strong statement. I think it's true. I think it's evidently true. If we can't somebody can't change it, this will happen again. And I'm going to talk about how to change it. The regional leaders clearly think they can manipulate the great powers, that they can use us as opposed to us imposing structures on them. As many of you know, I've spent a lot of time around American foreign policy in my career. I was flabbergasted when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia kept the Secretary of State waiting for a night. Made him sit there and wait and then showed up in the morning. You don't do that. It's sending one of those messages that says, wait a minute, the stars are misaligned here a little bit. Why is Iran waiting? Maybe they're waiting because they don't want to fight. Maybe they're waiting, as I say there, because they're playing smarter than they used to play. They understand that Israel is now getting a lot of pressure from everywhere in the world. You've seen it in Europe more than here. You're starting to see it here. You're seeing it in the region. Maybe they're just letting it play out a little bit before they do anything. In 2014, when there was another Gaza intervention, Arabs inside Israel went to the streets. And it got very, very nasty very, very quickly. So you've got these other remember the four enclaves, you've got these other places that have Palestinians in them that are watching this happen and are getting angrier and angrier. Will they do something? That certainly in the pessimistic scenario, it's happened before, it could certainly happen again. It's beginning to happen in the West Bank. It's not being widely reported. There are a lot of incidents in the West Bank in the last few days. The Arab Street. Anybody who hangs around the Middle East is constantly being told about the Arab Street as though it's some kind of mythical thing that drives power. I think it's nuts. I've always thought it's nuts. But all of the Arabs believe in it. So at the moment you see, and in the past you have seen where King Hussein, who was an otherwise normal person, did strange things because his street was exploding. So he's got a bunch of younger leaders throughout the Arab world. We have no idea how they'll react under pressure. They're not yet under pressure. We've seen demonstrations, but nothing really out of hand yet. But who knows? And I think there's no doubt that Russia and China are benefiting from what's going on. China because of what it's doing behind the scenes. Russia because we're talking about this and not Ukraine tonight. And you've seen, if you look at the polling in the United States, it's clear that American public support is shifting from Ukraine towards Israel in terms of aid or no aid, those kinds of questions. You've seen what's going on in the Congress. So optimism, pessimism, you make the choice. Wars end. And as you think about how this war ends, there's two phases. The first phase is sooner or later the actual fighting ends. Former Prime Minister of Israel said in a meeting 2 days ago, this could take 2 or 3 months. This is the destruction of Hamas. Now, will the world give Israel 2 or 3 months to do what they've been doing for the last 20 days? As I said, that's the question. But it's a couple months of active fighting, it looks like. That's at least the Israeli assumption. What happens whenever it ends, however we're going to know it stopped, the question is what happens the next day before we get to these big picture questions. So you're going to have Gaza, which is going to be mostly rubble by then. We have no idea how many Palestinians will be in Gaza, not have been pushed out. I'll come back to that in a second. But it's going to be a mess. Hamas will be mostly destroyed, and Hamas, whatever passes for authority in Gaza, is Hamas. So if the Israelis succeed in destroying Hamas, no one's in charge. How does it function? There's three possibilities at the moment. One is the Israelis stay and become the occupying authority again. They left in 2005, and they left because the settlements were leaving. And you need to occupy West Bank or Gaza. You need both settlements and the military. They go together. It's symbiotic. Once the settlements were gone because of the Sharon negotiation, the IDF had to pull out because they could not have sustained themselves. So, do the Israelis stay as the occupying power, and for how long, and actually run the place? That's one option. The Israelis don't want to do that. Nobody wants the Israelis to do that, but that is one option. The second option is that somehow the Arabs, and there's an active negotiation at the moment, to get a bunch of Arab states to come together, put together sort of a UN-like force, but under an Arab banner, to manage Gaza. I would be stunned if any of those countries actually want that role, because once there, how do you get out of it? But that is the proposal. And the third is a straight-out UN force, and there's a long history of UN forces in the region. Who would participate? You can't have the Americans there for all sorts of reasons. Who would want to go in, and how would they do that? But you've got those three options. Israel, Arabs, UN, you send the Brazilians or Argentinians or somebody who doesn't speak Arabic. That's literally how do you keep peace once. Then what happens? So President Biden has now repeatedly said, 2 states. Our vision of the future is 2 states. I'm going to come back to that because I think that's a vision of the past, not the vision of the future. It's a nice to have. It's an impossible to have in my judgment. I'll tell you why in a moment. Gallant has said, as you see there, once we're done, we're going to just close off the borders. We are not going to allow any Palestinians ever again into Israel to work. We will take no responsibility for what happens in Gaza. We'll just seal it. Now, Gallant, he's the guy with the boot on the neck, remember. He's a pretty tough guy. But it was leaked 2 days ago. There is a document leaked out of the intelligence ministry in Israel, which was a planning document. And if you've been in government, people plan all sorts of things. And it suggested that there were a couple options. The middle one, which they seemed to prefer, was push all of the Palestinians out of Gaza, make it an Egyptian problem, and just shut it down. Don't occupy it, just leave it there. It's do what you did when the Israelis left Sinai. They literally just destroyed all their settlements and went home. They left nothing there. So the government has now admitted that, yes, this is a planning document, but it's just a planning document. Don't take it too seriously. That is consistent with what we've seen so far. If you've pushed 1 million people out of the north into the south, in theory, what are you going to do when you then keep on moving the military down into the south? Going to send them back to the north? Or are you going to open that gate at the bottom and push everybody out? The Egyptians have said, we will go to war with Israel if that happens. So, that's a problem. But maybe we just try to take the status quo and make it work. So, Tony Kortesman is a very clever strategist who's floated in and out of American governments. He's at the Center for Strategic and International Studies these days. And he's actually saying, wait a minute. You got land, you got people. By the way, most Palestinians in Gaza before the war, there's a question. If you could leave today, would you leave? If you asked us that question and we were there, every one of us would raise our hand and say, I want out of here tomorrow, I don't care where I go. 75% of Palestinians in Gaza said, no, I don't want to go. This is my home. That's a problem. So Kortesman's saying, okay, that's a reality. Let's go knock on the Saudis' door. The Saudis are building a fabulous new city in the desert. the sustainable city, Naom. Fine, get $1 trillion, make Gaza actually what it could be. You can build something anywhere. The Israelis have proven that. The Singaporeans have proven that. So actually get serious about creating the conditions for prosperity and peace among the Palestinians. See, now the little problem with that again is it hasn't happened in 75 years. Two-state solution. So this is before October 7th. What do Palestinians think in both Gaza and West Bank? Something like a quarter support the two-state solution. Most do not. Most want armed action or popular resistance, which is more or less the same thing, and believe there's almost no chance in the next 5 years. Remember how young this population is. They're hopeless. And I don't mean that they're hopeless, I mean that they have no hope. They are without hope. So we can sit in our councils and say, two-state solution makes a lot of sense. Let's go impose it on them. One of the proposals at the moment floating around Washington is, why don't we have the Palestinian Authority take charge of Gaza? They were thrown out. The Palestinians in Gaza hate them. They don't like them. But we're going to say, we're going to impose them because, well, they're Palestinians, they're all the same thing. What do the Israelis think about two states? This is a poll, again, from before the war, September. All of these numbers must be worse now. Something like 35% of Israelis think the two-state solution is viable. And these are the people who are there, the Palestinians and the Israelis. They don't think this can be done. Part of the problem is that. That's the West Bank. The little red dots are settlements. The green part is nominally, it's under Palestinian Authority control except for security, and Israel controls everything else. You can't build a state out of that. That's not possible. If you go look at all of the maps that have been negotiated over the last 40 years on two-state solution, they have a state, that green more or less is Oslo, from the Oslo negotiation. That doesn't look like a state to me. So how could you turn that into a state without saying to something like 700,000 Jewish settlers, sorry, we're bulldozing your homes. You made a bad, we changed our minds, you have to go. Two-state cannot happen. We can talk about it all we want. It's a way for us to feel good that we have a solution. It's a two-state solution. What are the U.S. interests? Our greatest interest in this is to avoid a regional war. Regional war has, and by regional war I mean very precisely, Iran, Israel, maybe the Arab states, God knows what the Turks do. They can be on both sides at the same time. The Egyptians. This could get very messy very, very fast if it blows out of that. And unlike Las Vegas, what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. And you know that will have manifestations. We wanted and have demonstrated support for Israel. From my point of view, I would have been a little more nuanced than we have been. We want to rescue hostages and travelers. You saw a couple dozen got out today. There's two kinds of people, two kinds of Americans. There are a whole bunch of hostages still, but there's a couple hundred people that why they were traveling in Gaza is a different question. It's not exactly a great place to do tourism. But they were there, and they're stuck there. So how do you get them out? We want to limit the geopolitical fallout. We are trying to figure out how to cope with the Chinese. We're trying to figure out how to cope with the Russians. We want this not to be another occasion for us to lose ground geopolitically. We want to avoid increasing our commitment to the region. We thought we were finished in the Middle East. You saw in the Wall Street Journal the other day, we literally had, we're not saying publicly, no intelligence on Hamas in Gaza because we turned it over to the Israelis. I don't know in what parallel universe you walk into your boss and say, well, we didn't think it was important enough that we actually had any on-the-ground intel, but we didn't. We pulled out of Kabul, we're just systematically pulling out. We still have something like 45,000 troops in the region. That's a different issue. But they increasingly are base-bound. And we want, remember the pivot to Asia. We want to pivot at least out of the Middle East. And we want, in a perfect world, to limit damage to the Arab-Israeli normalization effort. That, although it was I think Trump was a useful idiot, not a causal factor of that, but nonetheless, it happened under he gets credit because it happened under his presidency. The Biden administration has gone all in on the Saudi-Israeli deal. So we want that to happen if possible. And again, can those interests be realized without a new approach to the Palestinians? I think the answer is evidently no, but I'm not sure that everybody else agrees with that. Butterfly effects. You all know what a butterfly effect is. Butterfly flaps his wings in the Amazon and there's a typhoon eventually. Because when you disturb a complex system, weird things happen. That's a law of physics. It's also a law of politics. So butterfly effects that I can think of. Rising anti-Semitism, which is evident. It's evident here. It's evident in Europe. It's evident in lots of places. I would add to that rising anti-Arabism, or whatever the word would be, which is also happening in communities in this country, in Europe, and in Israel. Renewed terrorism. If you're in that business, you are now got your radar screens tuned way up, because this is when that kind of stuff happens. There are potential, we've already seen attacks on American forces in Syria. We've seen a couple other attacks in other places, again in the region. The odds are more. Europe has, I think, a fundamentally different view of this conflict than we do. We are all out supporting the Israelis. The Europeans are, to put it mildly, much more nuanced. They can't quite, as on many things, figure out which side they're on, but nonetheless they can feel that they think we've gone nuts. And so you can see that tension beginning to grow again. It's going to impact Ukraine. That's why Zelensky immediately raised his hand and said, I'll go to Israel too. And the Israelis said, no thanks, we actually don't want you. But the potential to distract the Americans in particular from Ukraine is really quite high. Democratic Party's in trouble. You all reading and hearing, and some of your friends probably are really angry, especially if they tend to be young and in New York City. They're really angry about this. And we're looking at an election next year that looks 50-50. So anything that affects turnout, anything that affects enthusiasm for one candidate or the other matters enormously to the United States. Energy prices aren't doing anything yet, and that's part of the good news. But it wouldn't surprise anybody if this goes wonky in a week or two that the Saudis say, we just got to cut back. Or the Iranians say, we are going to cut back. Or the Russians say, us too, we'll help out here. Economic downdraft. The United States economy is booming. We could talk about that some other time. Europe is not. Parts of Europe are really, Germany, for example, is in a recession. One can imagine that this is one more straw on the camel's back of a global economy, the Chinese, that really is not doing quite well. So the question is this: which future? One that looks much more like the past, which is all about ideology, sectarianism, and hate, which has been the characteristic of the last 75 years. I don't care any of this stuff about, oh, we're all God's people, we can all live together. We can't. They evidently can't. They have not been able to. Unless maybe this is the last splash of that old, you've pierced the boil. Could be. In which case, could we get to a world focused on peace, prosperity, good governance, that somehow everybody says, yep, we got to solve the Palestinian problem. Yep, we got to find a way to make these Abraham Accords really work, and work not just for the people who are already rich, the Saudis, don't actually need this deal in economic terms, but work for the region. That requires, I must say, a lot more optimism than I usually end my talks with, but at least it's possible. It's possible that we come through this in a better place than we are right now, because right now I think we're in a pretty bad place. I'm going to stop there, see if any of you have any questions. Okay, and then I have a question for you, which I'll come to in a second. Yes, sir.
I have a statement or two to see what you think about it. First of all, I don't believe that any of the Arab states really care about the Palestinians. I think they really believe they're a pain in the ass more than anything else. And second, what you're pointing out is the Biden plan of a two-state solution may sound nice philosophically, but there's no way that the Fatah group will be able to run the show because they're so corrupt, etc. And Hamas is much more popular than any of it. So maybe there'll be, if there's a two-state solution, there'll be another group, maybe a different name, but it'll be a Hamas-like group that will run the so-called
Palestinian state.
Palestinian state, including.
So let me respond to both of those. I agree with the first. If the Arabs wanted to solve the Palestinian problem, they could have at least behaved differently for the last 60 years, 50 years, 40 years, 30 years. If you recall, there was a moment when the other state was going to be Jordan, and that almost became the Palestinian state, and the king had to solve that problem. So yeah, they are a pain in the butt, but there's still a so what, because they obviously affect everybody. With regard to two-state, I do object. It cannot be called the Biden two-state solution. In 1947, the UN plan was for two states. And I have a whole bunch of maps that I don't have here. You can see what the two states looked like in 47. And then over the course between 47 and now, those two states, they've changed because Israel took its shape and form through a series of wars. But we've been negotiating, the world has been negotiating two states. It came pretty close a couple times, but it has long since failed. If you remember the Camp David Accords, remember the Oslo Accords, there's just endless accords. This has kept generations of diplomats busy, well-fed and well-occupied, and they have produced nothing. And I know that's harsh, but if you're in business and you're doing deals, and you get to this deal, you really want to do this deal, and you spend a whole year on it, and you're sitting at your New Year's Eve party, and you're saying, I'm going to get it done next year. And hopefully your CFO comes up and says, you know, boss, a deal that won't close won't close. This is a deal that won't close. The conditions do not exist for a two-state solution. The people don't want it. The leaders don't want it, and leaders, air quotes. How do you do it? His hand is up first, I'm sorry. In the back.
I have a privilege, though not very nice privilege, to witness from outside, of course, all those wars, starting from 1948. My age allows me that. I can say that definitely two-state solution is not possible. It sounds plausible. No, it's impossible. How come for so many years the wars, and wars? But there is an explanation which is skipped here. I understand you gave a very good analysis, but you cannot observe everything. Look, if children from young age, from the time they born, educated in killing a Jew, in awarding those who kill the Jew, how can they coexist? Then it goes from generation to generation, from generation to generation. The other thing which also was almost missing here, I want to clarify. Mostly people of the world, of entire world, is talking about Palestinians. Though that talk started not that far away, not far ago. Arabs, not Palestinians. Arabs. We're not talking about ourselves here as our ethnicities Vermonters, right? We live in Vermont, but we have certain ethnicity, each of us, having nothing to do with the word Vermont. It's not an ethnicity. The same there. Yemenites, who live in Yemen, Arabs, who live in Saudi Arabia, Arabs, who live in Syria, Arabs, and so forth. That meaning of Palestinians was artificially created by KGB. Don't think I'm crazy. I very well know what I'm talking about. I lived long enough seeing how it was developed. So, in my view, it is just impossible. What is possible? Just one state solution, and the other states, Jordan, Egypt, take that. Egypt, it says that they will start the war with Israel if that solution will be promoted. If Arabs from Gaza go to Egypt, so what? Egypt started the war. Once it was a war.
Well, let's not redo the whole history because we'll be here for weeks.
I understand. Yes, but what I'm saying is just one state solution. The rest is everything else, but not two-state solution. And one more, just technical clarification. Technical. There is a talk from qualified people that not 200 kilometers of tunnels under the Gaza, about 500, substantial difference. That's all.
Well,
thank you very much.
We'll know when they do the history. I think the next, I'm going to come to you after, well, coming up to you.
I was just going to ask if you have a take on the Iran appeasement that I guess started in the Obama administration. I mean, is that a failure based on where we are today and the fact that a lot of folks are, you know, the war dogs are out for Iran in parts of Congress? Or do you have any take on that?
That's another hour talk. The very, very short version of, and you have to put the Obama thing, which was negotiated by Secretary Kerry, the criticism, if you look at just the agreement, was it a good agreement? Within itself, it probably was. It excluded, however, missiles, transportation, it excluded a lot, and their third-party behaviors. Trump comes into office and says, oh my God, you left all this other stuff out, so we're going to exit until we can renegotiate the whole thing. And that probably was right, and that can't be negotiated. But we are where we are. As a result of this history, Iran is a nuclear threshold state. Why, I didn't mention before, but why is Iran quiescent at the moment, apparently? Probably because the supreme leader seems to be dying. He's been dying for some time, so he refuses to get on with it. But he may be close. There's some intelligence that suggests it's getting closer, which means all the guys around him who are jockeying for their futures aren't actually interested in a war at the moment. They're interested in sustaining their own base and figuring out how Iran works. So maybe we're lucky at the moment because in Iran-Israeli war in this. That's why we have two carrier groups in the Med. One's about to pull out and go south. We've got a number of other Navy forces in the region and on the way. Those may be there to help with hostage rescue, which would be a terrifically bad idea. But they're probably there to deter, and that's what we say publicly, to deter Iran. Strikes me that it's more than you need to deter Iran, but I'm not an expert in that. But the good news is Iran at the moment is deterred. Iran, however, is not finished. There's two possibilities. Iran did this amazing deal with the Saudis. They hate each other. They are at least as much of enemies of each other as the Iranians are of the Israelis. And all of a sudden they have diplomatic relationships. And all of a sudden the ministers are going back and forth. And so that something happened. We don't know what the deal was because we didn't do it. The Chinese did the deal. That would be much more hopeful for the future. In Iran that just says we don't care about the rest of the world. We're going to live in harmony in our region. That would be a good outcome. Is that possible, or has Iran not changed its colors? Nobody knows. You have to wait for the microphone, though. Not that you need it, but she insists.
So the goal is to destroy Hamas. But isn't there the next generation of Hamas that is very well trained? How do you destroy the ideology?
Well, I'm not making the case. The Israelis are making the case. What they very specifically have said, we want to destroy, which means kill, the leadership. They want Daif. They want the people who are in charge. We want to kill as many fighters. Now, some of those fighters aren't very old, partially to your point. And we want to destroy their capacity to make war, which is the tunnels. And it's the missile factories in the tunnels. And it's all of the accumulated weaponry in the tunnels. So they want to clear all that out. How you do that in an urban area as dense as this one is the $64,000 question. It's
Not knowing where the hostages are also.
Oh, that's why you should not count much on those hostages. It must be the case that given the population casualties, that there have to be hostage casualties too. It's just the nature of dropping a lot of ordnance on a very small place. But your question is the right one. You've got half of the population is under 18. They have lived, this is their life. This is what they have lived with. It's the point you made. It's what they've grown up with. So how do you create something very different? If you don't, then it's that one. That continues forever. And if you're a betting woman, you would probably put your money on that one. There was a question over here. It disappeared.
Where?
There we go. Ed.
I just wanted to know, I was surprised in several of these slides you bring up the notion of receding ideology and sectarianism and factionalism. And I see the world as going in quite the opposite direction, even in individual countries. Could you just talk a little more about that split?
So I suspect we don't have a lot of Trump voters in this room. But during the Trump administration, they, like every other administration, when they started looking at the Middle East, what the State Department pushes up is two-state solution. The very first briefing papers, by definition, talk about, because they've been talking about, that's what they know. So, they pushed that up. The president, in his wisdom, named his son-in-law as responsible for Middle East policy, since he was such a scholar of the Middle East. So Jared started wandering around, and he started running into two kinds of people. Those kind of people that didn't want to talk about the stuff that he knows, which is buildings and bank accounts, and then these kind of people, particularly in the Gulf. And he got this, they made an offer to the Palestinian Authority, which went nowhere. I mean, if you try to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, it is like talking to that wall. And Jared, who has the patience of my grandchildren, said, okay, this isn't going to work. Let's try something else. And the Emiratis approached him and said, we'd be willing to think about a deal with the Israelis based on economics. We don't care about all that crap. To your point about, do they care about the Palestinians? No. We need Israeli technology for things we're working on. We think there's deals we can do together. We're willing to recognize them. And you started the Abraham Accords, which got negotiated with a bunch of countries. So that's the world where, and that's completely non-ideological. That's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. It's the man who's now running the Emirates, etc. They aren't part of this old world that their fathers are. Why haven't the Saudis recognized Israel in the first chapter? Because the king is still very much in old school, one of those Arabs who pounds on the table about Jerusalem. The kid isn't. Kid could care less. The kid, he's the crown prince, and he's the power in Saudi Arabia and increasingly in the region. I think he's going to make all sorts of mistakes, but there is that kind of shift going on, certainly in places like Bahrain, in Saudi to an extent, in the Emirates, less so in Kuwait, God knows in Morocco. That there is a sort of modern generation beginning to say, this is interesting history, but let's move on. Now, they're all in a position to move on. I mean, that's the problem. Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza, are somebody else's problem. So And it was almost explicitly said in the Abraham Accords, yeah, we got to worry about them, but we'll get to them eventually. And if I were a Palestinian, I'd probably say, oh, wait a minute, I don't think eventually is ever going to happen here. And that is the problem. I think there is a move beyond ideology beginning in that part of the region. Because ideology has been a poor performer. It has produced this. And to some extent, and again, we'll see in Israel, Israel's problem is, as I said earlier, the demographics. Can they use this shock and come out of it with something other than a 1-seat or 2-seat majority to do crazy things? We'll see.
Yeah, this is not a question, just a statement. We have a nephew who has his own consulting business in Dubai, who is intimately involved with the economic development of Saudi, including this new huge city. And one of his observations is that already the Israelis are swarming over Saudi and being accepted at every level in terms of getting integrated into the economic development of Saudi. So there's quite a bit of acceptance already happening, powered by and motivated by economics.
Yep.
I have one question. Has there ever been any historical precedent where you've had this situation occurring, where the geography is totally screwed up and you spend a long time looking for a diplomatic solution, but in the end, the only solution is ultimate victory of one side?
The short answer is not that I know of. The slightly longer answer is I don't think the word ultimate applies. So let's assume this works like it's worked all these other times. They eventually stop fighting. What's left of Gaza sort of gets rebuilt. Some Arab money shows up. Maybe Gallant gets his way, and you shut the economic relationship, which isn't very big, but you shut it between Israel and Gaza. Maybe the West Bank doesn't explode; it just keeps on festering. It's not a particularly nice place. If you've ever been there. The only ultimate solution is to move the Palestinians somewhere else. I'm sorry? Well, no, they've not cared about them for a long time. You're going to care about them if they can come through that wall. Remember, this was not the border the Israelis were worrying about. The Israelis had one of their techie solutions that had made sure that border was impregnable, except it turned out not to be impregnable. And indeed, there is a little backstory to this. Part of the reason Netanyahu's finished is his last X years, he has been an advocate of trying to keep the West Bank and Gaza as far apart as possible, of allowing money to go into Gaza. We know what that money was being used for, ex post. Of containing. It's a bit like X. It's about containment as opposed to trying to change anything. It was a very explicit, quite often discussed policy in Israeli strategic circles in the cabinet because he thought he had him under control. Turns out he was wrong. Let me ask you all a question. If you could, you're sitting in the Security Council tomorrow morning, and we won't debate exactly what's in the resolution, doesn't matter. Would you vote for a pause or a ceasefire, whatever you want? Stop fighting now. No. All right, wait a minute, I want hands here. I want anybody who says, let's go with the yes, because a no is obviously going to win here. Anybody who would support a ceasefire or a pause today? Oh, there we go. Gore, you got to count. No, hold your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So, and everybody else is no? Probably half and half? How many are we?
No.
Okay, the no's, raise your hand, I'll count them. 13, 14. So it's a slight yes, but only a very slight yes. That's a serious problem. And it's a problem that's going to be debated every day for as long as this continues. Yes?
What is the war ultimately going to prove? I mean, if all of those people who voted no, they don't want to see it pause. Where are we going with this? It's just more devastation.
Well, that is the nature of the problem. I forget what the number of missile strikes were today, but there was a lot of them. So every day, that's how they're fighting this war, and it's how you have to fight this war, right? And they've got a lot of troops in there, and there's more coming, et cetera. So every day, go back to that war slide. Every day this continues, there will be pressure on Israel to stop. It'll either be couched as a humanitarian pause. Now, humanitarian pause means what? Right now, they're getting in a tiny fraction. Usually they get a couple hundred trucks a day. They're getting in a tiny fraction of trucks. There's no food. There's no water. There's none of this crap. I suspect the Hamas fighters have all this stuff. That's a different issue.
They have fuel, too.
Of course they have fuel. Stuff doesn't work without fuel. But they had that in Stalingrad, too. I mean, we know who gets the stuff. So the pause is argued, we've got to get people in and people out. As soon as, if the Israeli answer the question, as Netanyahu said yesterday, time for peace and time for war, Ecclesiastes, whatever the hell number it is. And that's what we're struggling with. Does your ultimate solution, does the solution come from do they finish cleansing, I don't want to use the word ethnic, cleansing Gaza, only of the bad guys. And one last point on that, at least.
We are not struggling. Israel is struggling. They don't want to fight.
Remember how crowded this place is, Gaza. Remember how surprised the Americans were, the Israelis were, the Egyptians were, all the people that are supposedly quite knowledgeable. What does it tell you? It tells you, let's say the 30,000 fighter number is right. 30,000 fighters, families are what, 4, 5, 6 on average? So a couple 100,000 people are around the fighters. How could there be such good operational security in a place this big where there are no secrets, where everybody knows everything, but nobody knew about this? So let's tell you about the population. Told me at the time, oh, I suspect they support what happened. Now, maybe not the barbarity, not the atrocity, because that wasn't supposed to happen. That wasn't in the plan, supposedly. But so it's your point about it's the ideology. It's a problem.
We always underestimate the underdog, and that's why everybody was surprised at this attack.
I grew up a Chicago Cubs fan, and that was long before they won any baseball games, so I understand underdogs. But I'm much more a Yankees fan, which I'm so angry this year, because they're supposed to win. There's one question here first, because you already had one. Sorry, Gloria. It's good. You need the exercise.
I know you said you weren't going to try to make projections or predictions. Nevertheless, what do you know, there have been drone strikes on U.S. Forces, nothing serious so far in terms of injuries. Do you have any sense or any prediction about what would it take for a serious United States response militarily in this?
Certainly, if there were a serious strike by the Iranians on anything, we almost have to respond. So if it's quite clear that the Iranians hit something, or more generally go to war, we said this publicly, actually. We have said we have a plan to go to war with Iran. Haven't asked the Congress about it, but we don't bother with Congresses these days about wars. So you got the big picture question. If a full-out war starts with the Iranians, I think the odds of the United States being involved is really quite high. The harder question is, as you said, drone attacks are real easy. Your kid can make a drone attack these days. So it's a region where there's lots of stuff lying around, and there's lots of people shooting stuff off, and there's lots of people who have an interest to show their colors in the fight against the Israelis. So there's a lot of low-level noise, deadly noise, but low-level noise. We all read about the commander, the Navy commander coming up through the Red Sea, that his radar showed something going overhead. He blew it out of the sky, blew 3 missiles out of the sky that the Houthis had shot off. But you have, I mean, that is the risk of wider war. And then the question, if you're sitting in the White House, the question is, what's the trigger? And what's the consequence if you get more involved? And if you go whack something, what happens the next day? And it's clear that, although I disagree with how it was done, the intent of the President, of the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor in going out there and going overboard was to scare the hell out of anybody that would do other things. This was intended, that's why we sent you don't need 2 aircraft carrier groups in the same place. And all this other stuff comes from the other direction. This is an old-fashioned, we're going to show you our strength. So don't you dare do anything. The problem with that is the one you suggest. What if somebody does? And then you trick into this, dominoes start falling, and these dominoes aren't going to fall in a straight row. They fall and sort of scatter all over the place. But we aren't in a position, we by definition are in a reactive position. We've taken our position. This is our position. We are there, we're there in strength, we are there loud and proud. Now it's up to them to say, will they want to do anything about it? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say you asked why would somebody vote no for a ceasefire? I mean, of course, I don't want to see civilians or kids killed, and that's obvious. If you took the 1,400 people killed and you did that in American lives, it's about 60,000 based on a population. If you took 220 hostages, it's about 1,200 Americans taken hostage. Whether or not they're dead or not is a different issue. But I mean, how could you ignore that and not? I mean, and you could say, oh, you should pursue diplomatic means, but Hamas is a terrorist organization classified as they're terrorists. So I'm not a military expert. I don't know anything, but I think that's the situation we have to put ourselves in as Americans. I mean, if 60,000 Americans were killed in a terror attack and 1,200 were being held as hostage, don't you think this country would do anything to rectify that and have the right to defend themselves? But what's that?
Is war the answer?
Well, I mean, you could be a pacifist and I respect that, and I might be one too, but I don't live there. And so I just think we have to put ourselves in those shoes, right? That's all I'm saying. Of course, I don't want to see people killed that are innocent.
There's a new hand over there, but while it's walking that way, the same argument, by the way, if you take so far 9,000 Palestinians against a population of 2 million and do the arithmetic, that's a big number. So that's part of the problem in this war, and it will eventually exhaust itself, but it's going to not be pretty. Yes, sir.
I just say, I think we can.
You've got to use the mic because they're recording.
I think we can look at recent history, 9/11, and those attacks didn't kill nearly the number of people you're talking about. And as a nation, we responded with, in retrospect, with what we know now, with a war with Iraq that was based on lies, that was a personal vendetta by George W. Bush. Remember him saying they tried to kill my daddy? Well, my point is, I think that initial response, that base response that we all might have, is to fight back, stand up for ourselves. And I don't deny Israelis that feeling and the right to do that, but I also think with the perspective of history, it's not the wisest response. I think that I read an article, I think in the Times this week, an editorial that talked about some terrorist attacks a few years ago in India, and how India basically chose not to respond. You just read that. And effectively what that did was increase global sympathy for them, global opposition to that group that attacked them. You know, what incredible discipline not to respond. And yet, in the long run, it seems like that worked out better for them.
Well, that's a good what if. What if after October 7th, Israelis whack something on October 8th, and then October 9th declare, that's it. The government would have been run out of town in Israel, for sure. Most Israelis would be absolutely besides themselves. Because, again, India's a big place, and when that happened, it didn't affect the entire sense of who they are. This did. I'm not defending it, I'm explaining it. This did. This fundamentally, it's PTSD time for society. Now that doesn't, you got to put that into context. You got to put it in the context of international law. You got to put that in the context of history. You also, most importantly, which is why I didn't talk much about history. History matters to me a lot, but it doesn't matter to what happens next, in a sense. What really we ought to be, this ought to be an outcomes conversation, not this, but this needs to be an outcome. What kind of world do you want within these next couple of years, and what are you going to do to make it? And at the moment, the Israeli answer, the only official one, is from the defense minister, which is a nihilistic one. We're just going to flatten this place and then close the doors and forget about it. I bet against that working in the long run. We're out of time. I don't want to cut you off. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, this whole question that you asked and what we've been discussing in this last session, it seems to me there is no answer. That's impossible. Both sides are right. Both sides are wrong. It's like Solomon cut the baby in half. You can ask the question. You ask certain questions about statistics and how many equivalent died. How do you write? What's the right policy to there? You could ask the question is, we're going to be killing 5,000 children under the age of 15. What price is that worth? And there's no answer to that. The same as your question. There's no real answer to that.
Got 2 minutes before she throws me out. I want to privilege the people who haven't said anything yet. So you're next after. Please. Yes, ma'am.
Even if we gave the Palestinians another spot somewhere, it doesn't matter where, and we cease fire, they're not going to stop going after Israel, because they're not going to stop until they get rid of them. And they get rid of all the Jews. So what have we solved?
I don't think another place is the solution. Most Palestinians, the biggest issue when the Israelis said move, a lot of people said the last time I did that, it wasn't I that did it, it was my great-great-great-grandmother that did that. They never came back. So if I asked this room, where were you in 1948? A couple of you were a couple years old. I wasn't yet born, but I was born real soon. But every Palestinian will answer about 48 as though they were there. And that's an issue.
But the point is, Hamas will never stop going after the Israelis.
Well, the idea is, what is their idea? The idea is, it's a bit like you get rid of the Crips and hopefully the next guys aren't quite as bad. It's not much, I'm not arguing for the idea, I'm explaining the policy. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say that there is a precedence for a different path. And look at the troubles in the north in Ireland. I mean, this is not the same, but it is a sectarian fighting and conflict that went on for a very long time. And we did reach a settlement, and a lot of it was in large part due to American diplomacy driving settlement. But the leaders on both sides, Catholics and Protestants, they reached a point where they had to have a different outcome. When you say outcomes, both sides wanted peace and drove towards that. It came down to the wire, but is it a little tenuous at times? But it created an independent state. There was no potential for two-state parties. We could talk about whether it's pragmatic, and we're still trying to drive towards it today. But This is a little different. There's a lot of fighting. It looks like it's going to take a long time for a resolution, not in the near term.
But it's hopeful.
It's hopeful.
Thank
There
you.
is a precedence.
Up here. I think it comes this way next. Oh, yeah. But you got to wait for the microphone because they insist.
Thank you. I get a very cynical feeling sometimes that in the viewpoint of some Arab states, Israel is doing the job they would like to do but never could. That the Palestinians are such a difficult, intractable problem, certainly from Egypt's point of view, could solve so much of this, that they would like to see, I won't say the word, but they just see this happening and saying, we can't do anything about it, we won't do anything about it, but in a way, this is what we would like to see.
I think that's truer of the neighboring states than it is of the Gulf states, because if you're the Jordanians, it's the suggestion that Jordan is the solution has been been bandied about for decades. And something like half of Jordan's population is Palestinian anyhow. So that's the Egyptians, which is a badly run country, the place is a mess. He does not want more poor people. Last thing Sisi wants. Lebanon is a terrorist state in name, and they don't need more terrorists. So certainly in the Levant, what you just said is undoubtedly the case, and those guys are way over there. So,
just one other thing.
But notice when we build stadiums for FIFA, they don't import Palestinian workers; they import Indian workers.
Yes, right.
This is not accidental.
It's a good point. Just one other point, that something that's always forgotten, that there is a sizable contingent in Israel of what I believe is called Mizrahi Jews, who were Israeli, who were Middle Eastern occupants, who were chased from their land in 1948. It's such a wide scope that you could almost go all the way back to Queen Isabella to find out where it all began. But this has been a part of a drastic, incredible relocation of peoples.
And that's exactly why I didn't want to talk about history. Because you pick your starting points. Oh, I want to start with Isabella. That's where it started.
Is that it?
I think it's it because it's after the witching hour.
Okay.